Hi everyone. I'm a little late, but not too bad for having a crazy weekend. Um, I want to do chapter 4 of Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach. If you've been following my other videos, you know we are on chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called Unconditional Friendliness. And this is kind of like a nice chapter to think about more self-compassion. She says that this is the gratefulness of your heart, the compassion that you can show, and it really requires you to face and recognize your fears, your hurts, your judgments of yourself, to kind of embrace them and give you openness to experience them as they are. So she talks about a couple of different stories, a personal story of hers, but also the Buddha story of inviting Mara to tea. And she has a lot of that come up if you look her up anywhere. But Mara is kind of like the embodiment of doubt. She kind of focuses more on the fears and hurts, but in general, Mara is supposed to be the embodiment of any doubts that you're having, self-doubt. And Buddha, instead of ignoring or avoiding, invites Mara down for tea. And I think the symbolism behind that is, pretty out there, that we can't just push away the doubts, that we have to kind of recognize them with friendliness and compassion, because we need to treat ourselves, right? And doubts are part of ourselves, as a friend would. So she goes on to say that just so you know that doubts and the idea of pushing and avoiding is deeply entrenched. It's a coping mechanism. Like if you study any psychology or neuroscience, it is a coping mechanism that is very apparent for most of us. But what Tara is saying is that we have to kind of make friends with ourselves and our life and not ignore those parts, because to truly know ourselves, right, we have to look at all of the things that are affecting us. It's kind of like the whole idea of the I see you, I recognize you, and that's where we start to open up and have the freedom to grow. So she also talks about if you ignore, right, or avoid these things, that you end up really torturing yourself with whatever those feelings are, whether it's failure or shame, guilt, inadequacies. And that leads to what she would call the trance, which she focused on in that first chapter. And what happens is we don't even recognize the feelings that it's bringing about. Sometimes we're so good at ignoring or pushing it off that we don't even recognize. She then goes on to talk about inquiry mindfulness, which I would say if you've done any sort of mindfulness, this is usually the basic mindfulness that you start off. If you've done Headspace or Calm app, any of that, or even on YouTube, if you look up, basic meditation or basic guided meditation, they usually do a body scan. And when you do a body scan, this basically is the beginning of what she's talking about. You go a little deeper, you scan from top to bottom, and you pay attention to the spots that, are feeling tight or maybe weird, and you're paying attention especially to things like your heart, your stomach, your chest, your throat. These are all places where you can hold these kind of feelings. So you go through, you note, and you basically say to yourself, what in my body is looking for attention? Is it looking for acceptance, right? Like, what is it? When you really get into this type of mindfulness, it's a way that you can listen to your heart and your mind and your body together. And it can awaken what's present instead of, oftentimes I talk about, usually anxiety is about focusing on the future, the what ifs, and depression is about the past and getting stuck in the cycles of it's always like this. I have had all these things happen and it's never going to change. It's always the same. So instead of doing any of those, you are focused only on the present, where things are being held in your body presently. And at this moment is really important. And also, this is different from psychology or therapy where you're digging into why. This is not about digging into why. This is only looking at where you're holding on to things within the body and recognizing them and then giving them space and allowing for whatever it is. So I'm just reading my notes as per usual. She talks about you want to pay attention to your immediate feelings and sensations. It requires recognizing these things without judgment. And the reason without judgment is if you go into a meditation with judgment, and I'll give an example of myself because I recently had small laparoscopic surgery. And sometimes it's really easy to judge that as like, I don't want to recognize that as a hindrance or pain or something that needs to be healed. And if I go into meditation with that judgment, I don't pay attention to it because I've already said in my mind that, oh, that's something I don't want to recognize, right? It's a weakness, or I'm feeling like it's something that it should be better or something like that. And if you go into meditation like that, you're not really giving it the attention and the awareness that it needs. So it can actually cause like a blockage. The second thing that she talks about is naming and noting, what is happening for you. And basically, when you do this, it helps you recognize the things that are happening and then allow them to be heard, validated, and then pass. This is kind of like the flow of thoughts and feelings and sensations. It allows you to still find what needs attention, but it also, I try not to say but also, and it also allows you to give it a name. So if you're noticing that you're tight in a certain area, or you're noticing a sensation in a certain area, and you can name it, right? I'm feeling this, and what does this mean? What really needs attention? I'm afraid. I'm tight. Feel like I am about to blow a giant opportunity. I have fear of rejection. I'm judging myself, or whatever it means. If you can name that in your head, it actually opens your awareness and allows you to accept that fear, that doubt, that Mara that is present. And when you do that, you can practice unconditional friendliness upon yourself. So you let all your parts be known, and it stops them from kind of like unconsciously trying to have power. So oftentimes if we push or avoid things, they tend to bubble up. You've heard that, right? Like you can't ignore it forever. It will make itself known. This is the way that you consciously give it a name and notate it and validate it, and so that it doesn't bubble up later or try to come out ferociously, right? She goes on to say that you should be aware of any of your suffering whether it's anxiety or self-doubt or guilt or shame, because it allows you to reconnect to your true heart, which I totally I jam with all of this. And it also frees yourself of self-judgment, and you can see that the judgment of yourself falls away and allows for that kindness to come in. So if you're judging yourself harshly, you cannot be showing unconditional friendliness to yourself. So this is like a pivotal point. And she doesn't say it in so many words, but basically, if you cannot find the self-compassion, you are blocking the friendliness, right? The compassion within yourself. You cannot practice radical acceptance unless you can get to these points. And she says beautifully, this is a way that we sit beside ourselves, that we friend ourselves, that we treat ourselves as that dear friend instead of criticizing and judging and belittling. It's sitting beside, which is so beautiful. I just love that imagery, to sit beside yourself, to show yourself that unconditional friendliness. I love it. I love it. I love it. The last thing she talks about is saying yes. And I know like saying yes has garnered some popular attention. But what she is talking about is not necessarily saying yes to all the actions, but saying yes and stop resisting or holding on to things. Because when you validate something, you can recognize it, you can name it, you can validate it, and you can allow it to pass. This is true of physical pain, emotional pain. It's true of almost anything, that in order to move beyond it, you have to recognize it, right? You can't move past something unless you recognize it. So the more you dig your heels in and avoid it and have resistance to it, the stronger the emotion or feeling kind of takes on. So she also has a nice part in this chapter where she talks about that she realizes that when you say yes to these things, it's a lot of vulnerability, right? Like there is not a way around that because it's an openness to what is happening. So saying yes to your feelings and thoughts, I'm turning my page, hopefully, and not double paging, allows you to see clearly and beyond the fakeness. Now, people are really good at being fake. You can fake kindness, right? But to truly have kindness, you cannot fake it. And you know that when you see fakeness, and it is very apparent. And we don't want to fake it with ourselves. We want to be real with ourselves. So opening up and giving space to all of that is really important. And she does give a little bit of a warning. I would say it's a trauma warning. If you've had a traumatic experience in the past, be aware that saying yes and being open aren't necessarily about going back and exploring all the trauma. It might be saying yes to healthy coping, recognizing that this is a trigger to my trauma, and then being open to the healthy coping mechanism, right? I see you trauma, I see you trigger, and I recognize what I really need is to sit beside a friend, to call them up, to have a cup of coffee, to take my antidepressant pill, to make an appointment with my counselor. Those are what you're saying yes to, not saying yes to, I'm going to reopen my whole trauma that happened. So I think that's a great warning, because when this happens, we are fragile, and doing that, is one of those places where you can end up in not a great place. So recognizing and naming doesn't mean acting on it. And it also means that you're aware of what needs to happen after. The last thing she talks about is the idea of smiling. and how bringing a smile to your lips actually does, and they've done studies on this biologically, it sends chemicals and messages to your brain that bring the parasympathetic nervous system back on track, which is your calming state, the one that's not in flight, fight, or freeze. So just the act of perhaps from last week taking a sacred pause and then bringing a little bit of a half smile to your lips. And she, I thought this was cool. She talks about how oftentimes you see the depiction of Buddha in statues with a smile or a half smile on the lips, which is a conscious thing to do, that it's important to do that. So she goes on and says, we have to stop comparing ourselves, even with ourselves. Stop comparing yourself to 20 years ago. Stop comparing yourself to what you think you should be in the future. This links back to how I have talked ad nauseum sometimes on expectations, right? Not expecting to be yourself that way. But if you can stop comparing yourself and just be with how you are in the present moment, you can really appreciate fully what is happening now. That's a really important skill to have, to accept things how they are now and have gratitude for things how they are now. Really put you on that path of openness. Get rid of those shoulds and experience kind of how beauty is present. Like, it is what it is. I'm accepting what it is and recognizing all the beauty that is currently. So this is kind of a short chapter. She then has several meditations that she does, and I'm going to post those below so that your challenge this week is to do those meditations at some point. I was having a hard time with finding all three. I think there's 3 meditations she does. The one that I was having a hard time finding, so I'll tell you kind of how to do it here, and then I'll post the other 2, was naming, right? Naming the feeling. I couldn't find like a good guided meditation that wasn't like an hour long about it, because she, I think, has expanded this in her own practice. So basically, if you, I'm going to tell you what to do, and you can do this. This is the second one. So don't do this one first. Try and do the first one, which is, I think, like a body scan one. Try and do this one second. But get yourself into the same kind of space that she talks about for the first guided meditation. You're in a place where you're not going to be disturbed a lot, where you can sit quietly with yourself in a neutral position. I am a big fan of closing my eyes. If you don't want to, maybe pick one place where you can focus in front of you. Take a couple of deep breaths. Bring you and let go of things and get back into your meditative space. And then really think about a hard situation for you that you've been dealing with. So it could be whether it's pain. So for me right now, so that comes up a lot. Whether you had a hard situation with a friend or at work, whether you are fighting with a spouse or a child. Think about one of those difficult situations and say to yourself, how am I really feeling about this? And give yourself some time to let all of those thoughts come in. And then as they come in, take note and see if there is something that resonates and you could name. This is really about fear of not being in control. This is really about fear of rejection. This is about blaming myself for not being strong enough. Name it. And then repeat that in your head a few times. Okay? This is fear of rejection. Fear of rejection. Okay? And try to notice any sensations that come up as you name that. If you get lost in thought at any time, you can also name that and then let it pass and come back. Okay. After you've named it and you're noticing then sensations, I want you to say to yourself, is this really what it is? Or does this not feel exactly true? Is there something else that could be going on? If it feels true, again, note any sensations that come up as you have named it and recognize it. This is the I see you. I see you, fear of rejection. I see you. Okay? And then you can breathe in and breathe out. And then become more aware of your situation and open your eyes. So that is the second part of the meditation, which is just the naming it. The other two she does have videos for or audios for, and I'll post them below this video. So your challenge for this week is to go through those and again become more aware of being unconditionally friendly to yourself. If the practice of being unconditionally friendly to others helps remind you to be unconditionally friendly to yourself, I encourage that also. I know with my kids, it's much easier to practice that way, where we talk about, meeting others with the friendliness first. And because it's harder for them to kind of grasp the idea, but by doing that and practicing friendliness, and it can start just with that sacred pause and that little bit of smile, right? When you smile a little bit in your lips, it automatically smiles in your eyes, and it will bring your brain back online. So I hope you all have a fantastic week. Next week is chapter 5. I will be back on Monday morning talking about that. Have a great week.